right, so today is November 5th. Side note, Sunday is November 7th, aka my birthday, so I'm very excited for that. And I'm hoping the legislature gives the entire arts and cultural sector a big present in honor of my birthday. So we're really going to focus on the American Rescue Plan Act this morning, and I have created quite a chart. And the idea is I want to just sort of kind of recap this process, right? So, obviously, the American Rescue Plan Act is a federal piece of legislation. It's a federal law that is multi-trillions of dollars in spending and recovery spending. Every state received fiscal recovery funds, and that's really what we're talking about, right? There's money that went to municipalities and tribal governments, as well as counties, but we've been focusing a lot on that state level amount. And so in Massachusetts, we received $5.3 billion. And right off the bat, it was very clear, we were starting to get very clear signals from legislative leadership that they were not interested in spending it all in one shot, and they were not going to spend it really quickly. They wanted to take their time, and they wanted to gather a lot of public feedback. And so this chart sort of takes us through that process. So in June, I should also say, Governor Baker wants to get that money out as quickly as possible. And it's very clear, both from his proposal as well as from comments that he's made and coverage of this whole process, that his priority here is about increasing the housing production in Massachusetts and helping really housing vulnerable individuals stay in homes, right? So in June, the end of June, Governor Baker filed his proposal. In it, he included $100 million to be administrated and distributed by the Massachusetts Office of Tourism and Travel for cultural and tourism assets. Then in July and in September, the legislature held hearings, on the uses for the ARPA money, right? So their whole thing was like, we're not just going to make decisions. We want this to be a public input process. Throughout that process, we all advocated. I'll get to that in my next screen. But by the time the House Ways and Means Committee released their proposal in October, there had been, I think, about 7 formal hearings and a lot of informal communication with legislators about the uses for that money. The House Ways and Means proposed $125 million for cultural assets. So they removed tourism, they just made it for cultural assets, and they changed it so it would be administrated by the Mass Cultural Council, right, which is our state arts agency. That went through a process, right? They went through the amendment process. We all, rallied around Vice Chair Fernandez's amendment 109 that would increase the amount to $175 million. Unfortunately, that amendment wasn't successful, but what did happen is the final version of the House proposal has $125 million. There are no earmarks attached to any of that money, which means that all $125 million would go in the House plan, would go to the Mass Cultural Council for distribution through grant programs, not existing grant programs, for new grant programs to address stabilization and recovery and growth out of the COVID-19 pandemic for the arts and cultural community. Okay. So then earlier this week, the Senate Senate Ways and Means released their proposal. And man, I was disappointed. I'm sure many of you were, right? Because the Senate Ways and Means proposal was for $75 million, again, for tourism and cultural assets, to be distributed by the Mass Cultural Council. What's interesting about this version is that they actually omit artists and individual creative workers as eligible for any of that relief funding, right? So it would just, in the language, it says for cultural organizations. We know our ecosystem is made up of cultural organizations that are large and small, that are made up of individual arts administrators and creative workers and artists, and that in order for us to be able to continue to do the work that so many in Massachusetts count on around creative events and cultural participation, our entire ecology needs recovery. It's not just one piece that's going to get us through this. We all need recovery. And so Senator Kennedy, who is the chair of Tourism, Arts, and Cultural Development on the Senate side, has just filed an amendment number 2. They were really early. And that amendment would amend the amount to $200 million and would change the language so that artists are an eligible recipient of that of recovery assistance, right? So it would be cultural organizations and artists. So that's where we are. We are looking at sort of, if we think about this in a span, right? Senate Ways and Means, the floor is 75 million and House is 125 million. We have this amendment to hopefully get it to 200 million, but it's very clear that the Senate's priority is in mental health spending. Like that is where they have put an enormous amount of money from this ARPA spending plan, okay? That's not to say that we are not gonna advocate really hard, but this is the reality of where we are. And I want to set some expectations, right? So we're not going to stop. There's an amendment on the table. We have in Chair Kennedy, an incredibly passionate and stalwart advocate inside the building for arts and culture. And he's committed to trying to get it to 200 million. Okay. So that's our push. That's going to be our push, basically until Wednesday, when the Senate is expected to take up debate for their Senate proposal, okay? After that, the two versions will go into conference committee, right? So they have to negotiate the differences between the House and the Senate version. And then that version will go back to both chambers of the legislature for approval. And then that'll go to Baker to sign, veto, or line item veto. The trick here is that we're running against a clock. And that clock is that the legislature will go into recess probably on November 17th and won't come back from recess until the new year of the calendar, right? They, and by that, I mean, it's a full-time legislature, but they won't have formal sessions for that period of time between November 17th and like January 5th, probably. So there's real indications from the covers that I'm reading and the conversations that I'm having and hearing about that they're really trying to push to meet that deadline, that November 17th deadline, to get that over to Baker. It's also clear from some of the spending matches that are in both the House and the Senate versions that leadership has had conversations about priorities and where they have agreed on spending priorities. And so I think that's an effort to kind of move this process faster so that they can meet that deadline. Okay. So I'm going to move us to the next slide because I want to just sort of remind us a little bit. And this, my delightful timeline only starts at June 30th of 2021. And we all know that we've been advocating for a lot longer. But just really quickly, I want to just remind us of some of the advocacy touch points that we've done along the way. So when Baker released his proposal, the Mass Creative immediately sent a letter to legislative leadership saying that we didn't think this was the right use of ARPA funding, to have it just go to the Office of Tourism, Arts and Cultural Development for a marketing campaign, and maybe some of that money would go into the Cultural Facilities Fund, would exclude a lot of our sector and a lot of our arts community from getting to that recovery dollars. Then during those hearings that happened, right? Mass Creative testified at the economic development hearing that was held. Some of you on this call also testified, and then many of you submitted written testimony, right? So they've heard from us. And then we also had a couple of action emails that went out along the same time, right? So they've been hearing from us a while. It's important to note that House Ways and Means proposal, there was no guarantee that the arts and cultural community was even going to be included in that original proposal. Like there was a strategy that we were talking about in our office about, if we're not included in the proposal, what are we going to have to do to make sure that in the final House version, arts and culture are included? So the fact that it was baked into the original House Ways and Means version, and that it was $25 million higher than what Baker had said, is an indication of how our advocacy, our shared and collective advocacy is working, right? There were over 1,000 advocates who wrote to their legislators in support of Amendment 109. That's a big deal. That's a big number. And so I sort of expect, right, we're going to see the same thing when we're looking at our Senate advocacy, okay? And then we'll stand up and we'll continue to update you and find ways that we can reach out to our legislators during the conference committee negotiations, right? Once the Senate's finished their debate and we understand sort of the parameters that we're working with. Okay, so a reminder, we've accomplished a lot together. I did a summary this morning. So over the course of the last couple of months, we've sent over 25,000 messages to the legislature through the Mass Creatives Action Alert System. Those are just the ones that we know about. We know many of you have direct email relationships with your legislators, so we're not able to track that. That's totally cool. So it's 25,000, excuse me, 2,500 plus, right? That's a big deal. There was some pretty intensive participation from the arts and cultural community in the Cultural Impact Commission that happened over the summer, including a really well-attended public hearing that got coverage, right? It got news coverage about the needs of the creative sector and also the need for it to be equitably distributed, right? There was, right, we have testified along the way. There was a hearing for the Commonwealth Cultural Futures Act, which is the bill that Senator Kennedy filed at the beginning of the session, and many of you turned out for that too. There have been editorials, op-eds, and letters to the editor on the needs and the value of the arts and cultural community that started almost immediately after March of 2020. And just to follow up, right, those emails that were sent in support of Vice Chair Fernandez's amendment resulted in 84 state representatives signing on to co-sponsor that amendment. That's more than half of the House that's sponsored that amendment, okay? So, okay, before we elections, I'm gonna stop my sharing and I just wanna check in with folks. And I'm gonna look in the chat and see if there are any questions. Look at this, I'm just seeing that Maureen let us know that Senator Adam Hines has already agreed that he will co-sponsor the amendment. That is great to see. So Catherine asks, sorry. Catherine, can I ask you, I'm just having trouble reading your question.
Caffeine, I'm sorry. No, first of all, thank you so much for all that you and G and the whole Mass Creative staff and board have done. It's amazing. I think what we'd really love to do is, what can we do to help support you and be your partners right now looking ahead? We know what you've done. It's unbelievable, but we have a once in a generation time right now. So, we'd love to be able to just make sure we go beyond something we've ever done before to make sure that we take advantage of this once in a generation opportunity.
Yeah, and I think the answer in part is, Catherine, we've been doing it, right? Like when I say we, I don't actually mean Mass Creative, I mean like the arts and cultural sector, right? Like in some ways, the test we have been cramming for, we're seeing the results now in the House version, in the Senate version, right? And when the COVID Cultural Impact Commission released the report that the need for the field was 575 million, that's a huge number. It's what we need. It's a huge number. But the reality is that we're up against a lot of other sectors, and we have been very clear as a sector about our messaging and continuing to press upon the messaging. And the fact that we're looking at, from the House version, 125 million is, what is that? That's more than the annual state budget allocation to the arts, to Mass Cultural Council, is at 20 million, right? So I want us to just, it's not like we get what we get and we don't get upset. That's not what this is, but in context, this is pretty significant. And we are seeing the results of our shared collective advocacy over the last year and a half. That doesn't mean we stop right now. And it also doesn't mean that this is like, once this ARPA spending bill passes, we're done here. We're going to keep going, right? We will keep going on this because they haven't spent all the money, right? This is only about 3.6 billion of it. There's still going to be money left. We're looking at revenues that continue to break records. And so we'll continue on, but this is where we are right now. The other thing, so Temple, you can see the amendments for the House, from the House debate, are in the link. And then there's a weird procedural thing that happened on the Senate side where the Senate couldn't agree on the deadline for amendments to be filed. And what it's done is it's held up the public posting of the amendments that have been filed thus far. It may have changed in the hour since I took a look to see whether or not they were posted. So that's tricky, right? Because what it means is like from an advocacy point of view, I can't see which state senators have co-sponsored that amendment. Neither can you. And we also can't see what other amendments have been filed. There's reason to believe they will fix that later today. But that's sort of where we are at the moment. Okay. So Maureen says, tourism and marketing, there are no funds for tourism in the final House bill, and I didn't see anything when I reviewed the Senate bill. Rep. Blay proposed an amendment to the House bill. Yeah, so yes, so currently there are no tourism or marketing allocated spending in the House bill, or in the final House bill, there wasn't any, and there don't seem to be any in the Senate bill. Frankly, we have been advocating really very clearly for cultural organizations to get direct relief and to make sure that artists are getting direct relief. I know that the tourism industry, like the associations that are focused on advocating for tourism and marketing, have been doing a pretty heavy push, and there's reason to believe there might be something else coming along. But as of now, no, there is nothing in there. All right. Other questions? Okay, so I am going to, sorry, did I see a hand raised?
It's me. I have a quick question. Yeah. I'm thinking about the rest of the ARPA funds, because this is only a portion of them. Do you have a good feeling about what happens next and when they start those conversations?
I don't think they will start them until, I mean, one woman's opinion. They're going to come back they're going to go into like informal recess. The new year will start. Baker will release his budget proposal. The budget process will begin. They're going to want to get that done. They have a deadline of getting that done by July, right? They traditionally go over it. This is also July will be the second July in the 2-year legislative session, which means that they've got a hard deadline on a couple of other any legislation that they want to finish up, and then they'll go into August recess and go into campaigns to run for re-election. So there's a couple of places they may try to do a second ARPA spending bill in the spring, right? Which would frankly allow legislators to go back to their district and talk about the money that they've been able to distribute. That's no shade there. Like that's part of the process here. They could wait and say they want to hold on to it. They want to hold on to it until the next legislative session. They don't have to, they don't have to make a decision. There's not a deadline there, right? And they both in terms of holding on to the money in case, like what happens if variant XYZ is so catastrophic that it shuts everybody down again. There's wisdom to wanting to hold on to a little bit of that in order to be able to do that. And then there's wisdom in trying to get that money out before a potentially new control of Congress tries to claw back ARPA money, right? Like that's another rumor that's out there. I'm like sharing a lot this morning. But so I don't know exactly when they're talking about a second ARPA spending bill, but like those would be a couple of places where they might consider it if one woman's opinion is helpful. All right. Just again, to put this into context, right? Like there are a lot of sectors who did not see any money in either the House bill, final bill, or the Senate proposal. So let's take a breath and point out that our advocacy has worked, that the fact that these numbers have been included is a big deal, and it's not over, right? So there needs to be a very heavy push. The other thing that's really important to mention is that that 125 million is not earmarked for any one purpose or any one organization or any one individual, right? Those earmarks were left out of that 125 million, which means that's an entire 125 million that will go through a grant process as opposed to a political earmark process. The hope is that happens with with whatever the Senate puts out as well, because we want to make sure that as many of those dollars can be equitably distributed. And the thing that I think is important to note here is that there's another, and I mentioned this in our last webinar, there's another way of working here. There's another way of saying, like, let's just all individually go after our own earmarks. And that's true, you could do that. We would not have had 125 million in the House version if we had not shared together in united advocacy. That doesn't happen with a sector that isn't united and isn't sort of sharing and delivering the same message. And I can point to a couple of other sectors that can't get on the same page and aren't seeing that level of investment baked into the Ways and Means proposals. So our united message of advocacy is really important, and making sure that we're holding on to that will result in the gains that we want to see, right? So I'm gonna, unless there are other questions about ARPA, I'm gonna move on to my next topic, which I hinted at this morning or just now, which is local elections. So there were many communities in Massachusetts had elections. And so here are my questions for you. Do you now know who your mayor is, your city councilor, and your school committee members are, right? Do they know you? Is the other question. So there are a lot of new, in many communities, mine included, there are a lot of new faces or a lot of faces that have shifted into new roles in city government. And these are the people who are making on the ground decisions about how some of the ARPA money is going to be spent, right? Between local ARPA dollars and the elementary and secondary school emergency resources relief funding that was put out there. These are also the people who make decisions about long-term choices for your community. And so engaging with your local elected officials is incredibly important, and making sure that they know that you care about this issue. We've talked about this before, that when a legislator gets 5 emails on an issue, it bumps it up in importance. Now, the thing to know is that a phone call equals like 5 emails, and an in-person visit equals like 50 emails. And those in-person visits, and I bring this up in terms of local elections, don't have to happen in the State House or in your city hall building. Like state legislators and local elected officials, they all hold office hours. They all hold coffee hours. And those happen within your community, within your district. And you can pretty easily find out when those are, because many of legislators have social media accounts where they're posting when those times are, and so are local elected officials. Can you imagine what would happen if just 3 arts leaders from a district went to their local elected officials coffee hour and said, hey, I just want to talk to you about what's happening with the arts and cultural community. I want to make sure you know that these are the things we're looking at long term. What are your plans? How can we help you with your plans, right? This is the moment where we have value and we need to contribute that value. One of the ways that the Create the Vote Boston coalition has chosen to do that is that we are sending a letter to Mayor-elect Wu. It's to remind her of our shared priorities, right? And to recap for her the conversations that we've had throughout the campaign. And we are looking to send that letter early next week. So if you're on this call and you are a Boston-based artist, or you are leading an organization that is based in Boston, we really hope you will co-sign this letter. Also, if you are not in Boston, but you like this idea, feel free to liberally steal from the letter, right? Those letters can be co-opted and rewritten to address your local issues and be sent out from a coalition perspective to just about anybody. And we hope you'll do that. Mass Creative, now that the local elections are done, we are continuing to focus on ARPA, and then moving forward, we're going to be looking at the statewide elections that are coming up, and there's going to be lots of opportunities to engage and partner with all of us. And so we continue to work on this to raise awareness with elected officials on our sector and what our needs are. Okay, so I am way over time here, but I also want to let you know Mass Creative is launching our all-in campaign. Okay. Over the last 2 years, Mass Creative has been all in, right? We have made sure that every step of the way in terms of the pandemic, in terms of government choices around relief and recovery. We've updated you and helped you find ways to share in the advocacy. And frankly, make sure that like you don't always need us. You know where to find the information, right? Like that's our big goal here. And we recognize that we're not going to, like, this isn't going to stop. To Temple's point, this is only the first ARPA bill, right? And so we have a lot more work to do. Advocacy is a marathon, it is not a sprint. And so we are really hopeful that you will join us and we can count you in on our All In campaign. And so this is a campaign to increase the number of organizational members to Mass Creative. Make sure if you run an arts and cultural organization, you have renewed your membership, or if you haven't ever joined, that you join. And then also we want to be able to count more advocates, right? One of the biggest, most valuable talking points I have when I talk to an elected official is I say Mass Creative represents over 400 arts and cultural organizations and 23,000 advocates. That matters. That is a pretty big selling point in terms of moving our agendas forward, right? So help us be able to continue to do that. Help us be able to continue to deliver the resources like this webinar. In our All In campaign. And we will have more information, but you are all the first to know about this All In campaign. And we hope we can count on you. So finally, we will see you in a month, which is wild. Obviously, we will continue to update you via email and via social media, but scheduling has made it so that December 3rd is the next time we will see you. Most likely, you can expect a little survey from us to help us just recalibrate this webinar and update, make sure it's delivering the information and the resources that you need, and we will continue on together. So with that, I hope you all have wonderful weekends. I so appreciate all of you being on this call and being in community. It is literally a highlight of my every 2 weeks, so I will miss you for the rest of this month. But thank you for the birthday wishes. And know that we are always around. Give us a shout if you have specific questions. All right, have good weekends. Please get outside.